morning.
Good
Thank you for
morning.
joining. Good morning. Welcome to everyone from wherever you're joining us, or good afternoon or evening, depending on where you are. Welcome to IAA's first Fireside Chat. I'm Jeff Greenbaum. I'm the IAA's chair of the Public Policy Council, and today I'm going to talk with Stacy Feuer, who is the Assistant Director of International Consumer Protection at the U.S.'s Federal Trade Commission. One of the cool things that's happening today, and it certainly relates to some of the stuff we'll be talking about, is this is actually IAA's first live webinar that we've done across social media platforms. So we'll see how that goes. It's on Facebook, it's on YouTube, it's on LinkedIn. So hopefully people are getting to see it from all the different ways in which they consume social media. I am told that if you want to comment or ask questions, you can do that no matter what platform you're on. Stacy and I, in addition to our fireplace that you can see on the screen, we also have a window which allows us to see comments and questions and things like that. So if you do have questions or something you want to talk about, feel free to post it, and we'll try to fit that in. Anyway, Stacy, thank you for doing this. It's great to have you and to be with you and to talk to you. Stacy and I have had a fun time sort of preparing and thinking about and talking about the issues that we're going to talk about this morning. And so we're going to jump right in. The goal of today's conversation is to both talk a little bit about what the FTC does on the international front, how the FTC coordinates with other organizations and countries around the world to think about international consumer protection issues, and then to talk a little bit about the ways in which others can engage in the process of thinking about these kinds of policy issues. So I think a good place to start, since we may be talking to people who are not familiar with the FTC around the world, is if you could just talk for a second, Stacy, about sort of what the FTC is, what its role is, and what the core mission of the FTC is.
Great. So thank you, Jeff, and good morning. Good afternoon. A great wide world of the web that we inhabit. So the FTC, we are a U.S. federal government agency. We are a bipartisan independent commission with a unique mission to promote competition and protect consumers. I work in our Office of International Affairs on consumer protection and privacy issues. What does that mean? It means we work on everything from advertising to privacy and data, addressing lots of other types of emerging marketing practices. So that in a nutshell is what the FTC is. And I have to say, for those of you who are familiar with the FTC, this won't come as a surprise, but I do have to say that I am speaking today. My views are my own and not those of the commission or any of the individual commissioners. That said, and I always joke about this, I really hope that they would agree mostly with what I say. Otherwise, I'm not doing a very good job.
So that's a nice take on the standard FTC disclaimer. So can you talk a little bit about what the key goals are of the FTC's international work? Why does the FTC even have an international consumer protection division?
Yeah, so it's interesting. So our Office of International Affairs is actually quite broad. It covers both international competition issues as well as international consumer protection and privacy issues. And when I say consumer protection and privacy, we really at the FTC see privacy as part of our consumer protection mission. Why do we have an office? Well, as we all know, and as the pandemic has made clearer, we live in a world that is digital, going digital, ever more digital. Even before then, though, it was clear that developments in telecommunications and trade were really making the world a lot more global. Now, in the advertising space, it's true that brands still often segment their advertising to different geographic markets, but a lot of the bigger issues that we think about global, and some of the issues that we're dealing with locally, when I say locally, really nationally, at the FTC, are ones that we find more and more that our foreign counterparts are thinking about as well. So I guess for me to explain sort of why we have the program and what our goals are is to really identify the three buckets of our work, because I think that shows you sort of what we do. So the first bucket of our work is really building enforcement relationships. The FTC is primarily a law enforcement agency, and as a lot of this work goes global, we find that we need to call on our foreign counterparts both to share experiences and build expertise, but also in concrete investigations and cases where we may be sharing evidence or tactics or other issues like that. So a lot of our time is spent developing and building these enforcement relationships. The second bucket of our work is what I think could be called sort of promoting sound policies. And so the FTC has been around for over 100 years. We have a lot of experts here, and so we're often called upon in international organizations like the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, the OECD, APEC, the Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation, and UNCTAD, the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, to share that expertise as countries are discussing policies and best practices. We also policy, and in that sense, we are looking at what other countries are doing to see the global context for the decisions that and we do that in a number of ways through our work in the FTC. We often bring in foreign speakers, or we get papers from foreign participants. Some of our work, for example, a recent PrivacyCon conference that we held where we were asking researchers for papers. We expressly asked for papers from foreign contributors. Again, so we can understand what's happening globally, because obviously the work we do at the FTC is just one piece of this larger global economy that we all live in.
You mentioned sort of the pandemic, and do you feel like this sort of the way in which these conversations have changed? Obviously, they're happening virtually, but do you feel like views about some of these issues have changed as a result of people working remotely, people not traveling, people relying even more on digital technology?
I do. And I think there's been a lot of discussion I hear in international circles about that. Certainly, there has been some statistical or hard evidence to show that consumers more and more are moving to various websites and e-commerce platforms to do their shopping. And I mean, just anecdotally, I haven't been to the supermarket since March. I now have ordered groceries from a panoply of websites I never even knew existed. But I do think it's changed the conversation in the sense that we'd always talked about the digital economy, and somehow it always seemed a little separate from perhaps, the real economy. And I think what the pandemic has made clear is that the digital economy is the economy, and that to the extent that we have thought about things, more in an analog way, we're thinking about them in a digital way. And we can, and I know we're going to get onto this in terms of, what other countries are doing, but I think that there is just a fair amount of thinking in the world about what does this all mean? And what does this all mean for consumers and the way that they shop, the way that they behave? And what does it mean for businesses in the ways that they reach out to consumers? So I think we are in the midst of a profound transformation, one that we were already in the middle of, but I think the pandemic gave it a push. I think I'm going to use that phrase, pandemic push.
Well, it does seem, I don't know, I remember, as I'm sure you do, it was, 15, 20 years ago when the FTC issued some statement, basically saying, we just want to make it clear that, all the rules we have apply to the internet too, right? And it seems a little archaic at the time, but now it's almost like we need the reverse. It's like, just so you know, everything that's going on online now applies to what you're doing when you venture out into the real world. Another interesting thing you talked about just before we talk about, switch topics a little bit is, you talked about sort of building these relationships with, governments and, so that you're able to either cooperate or share policy issues or share information. Is there continuity? I mean, do you feel like over time, you build these long-lasting relationships that really do lead to this kind of deeper coordination and understanding, or or do you feel like you show up 2 years later and it's an entirely group of people who have entirely different views? Like how disjointed is it, or how much do you feel like there's actually like a logical thing that's happening?
That's a really good question. It's interesting because there are two pieces to that, right? There's the institutions and then there's the people. On an institutional level, we've done a lot to build of them. We have formalized through a memorandum of understanding or other agreements. So there's definitely a sort of a long-term institutional structure. I think about Canada, where we do a lot of work with our counterparts on the other side of the border. And we've worked with them, I think, since the 90s, before my time, through a variety of partnerships and different structures that have essentially been set up to ensure that kind of continuity. In terms of the people, obviously the people change. The FTC has a very, I would say, deep bench of attorneys in particular who have spent most of their careers at the agency, as I have. And so we've had a lot of continuity in our Office of International Affairs. I think among us, it's scary how much the years would add up to. That's true at some, but not all of our counterpart agencies. So there are agencies with whom we have longstanding relationships where, every few years we are talking to new people. But there are plenty of agencies around the world where there are people who have been doing this kind of work for a very long time. And I think on the consumer protection and privacy side of the work, there is kind of a passion for the work that keeps people at it for a while. So it's an interesting question that I hadn't really thought about, but I think there is a fair amount of continuity, but there are blips along the way, certainly.
So you mentioned Canada, so I'm going to use that as an opportunity to do an ad for our next Fireside Chat, which is in April, and I'm going to be talking to Kathy Bate, who is the legal director at Ad Standards Canada, which is the self-regulatory organization in Canada. So it's a logical the next step in the conversation. When you talk about sort of the various goals of your international work, one of the things you thought about is just the ways in which the FTC can be a resource to developing countries who are building sort of a more rigorous or defined consumer protection mission. And one of the things that I have learned over the years, sort of either speaking at conferences around the world or just through the members of like the Global Advertising Lawyers Alliance, who are coming at it from very, very different countries, is there are countries that have, almost no advertising laws or very, very little on the consumer protection side, and are really very, very interested in developing it. One of the things that's always interesting to me is there'll be a conference I'll go to in some country, and you'll see the regulators there taking notes because they're just so interested in how the US is doing it, and they're looking for ways to build it. I mean, I'd love to hear a little bit about, and I think this is so interesting to to companies as they think about the ways in which their businesses move into emerging markets. Like, how do you work with companies to develop sort of an infrastructure, and what does that process look like in terms of helping them, build out some sort of consumer protection laws that maybe weren't really there before?
Yeah, I see I've just gone off the screen, but I'm going to assume that our viewers can still hear us. That's a very interesting question, and it is it is an important part of our work. We've done a lot of work over the years to work with both developing countries, but also countries that are developing new laws or new agencies. And, it's an area that's really interesting to us. We've seen over the last decade alone sort of an explosion of interest in consumer protection in countries in Africa, countries in Latin America, and India. And how do we? So that's sort of it's a third bucket of our work that really combines sort of enforcement knowledge and policy issues. So we work with countries to both help them develop their technical capacity, and that often includes enforcement issues. How would you address this problem, right? You think it's a problem. Well, is it a problem? Can you identify what's the harm? What are your potential policy or law enforcement responses? And then on the policy area, we often provide input, sometimes through written comments, sometimes just through conversations like we're having now, when countries are writing new laws or new laws. It's a long-term proposition. On the consumer protection and privacy side, pre-pandemic, we would often go and meet with the relevant stakeholders there. And when I say relevant stakeholders, sometimes there's not an agency, sometimes there is. But beyond the agencies, we often meet with both businesses or business associations as well as consumer groups, since there's obvious wisdom that makes an agency's work successful or not. Sometimes with the top people, sometimes we sit down with the line people who are going to be enforcing the laws, who are going to be doing the investigations, coming up with theories. We've, in the pandemic, really not done that. And while we had always done some webinars and videos and virtual consultations, now we're doing a lot of that. And in a way, it's an interesting model, because rather than having one or two FTC staff maybe spend some time with one of our foreign counterparts, we now have everybody in the agency who has even just a niche expertise, who are able, via the magic of webcasting and webinars and Zoom, to be able to share their expertise. And that's really a very important part of what we do. I think I can't stress enough that the FTC, we have some very, very broad laws, right? And so our basic statute prohibits unfair or deceptive acts or practices in commerce. We use that to deal with lots of practices. Sometimes our foreign counterparts look at us and say, "Really? You did that with that law?" But what it does.
Sometimes your local counterparts say that too.
It teaches that. Yeah, but it does what it does is it often sparks conversations about how do you really make the decisions about what you might consider to be misleading or what you might consider to be unfair, and how do you spin that out? How do you provide guidance to business for what practices are acceptable and what practices you might find problematic? So there's lots of ways in which we do that, and I guess we've sort of started with the pandemic theme this morning. So some of that is evolving as we're doing more virtually.
No, it is amazing, doing all of this virtually, how easy it is now to have these conversations in ways that we wouldn't have them before. On the other hand, I'm bitter. I missed out on a really good conference in St. Petersburg, which
you go.
Hoping we'll get rescheduled. So what's the balance between sort of the policymaking cooperation side versus the sort of enforcement, looking at, really, some of those sort of cross-border or not enforcement issues?
Yeah, so that's a great question, because I've talked about all of them and they all are important. But I would say, the FTC is primarily a law enforcement agency. And so a really significant amount of time is devoted to enforcement cooperation activities. And that's the, individual case or investigation level. There's the level of putting in place those institutional structures, so negotiating agreements. And there's also what I would call the network level. So earlier I mentioned some organizations that are big international policy organizations, and those are organizations, OECD, APEC, UNCTAD, that are governments. In the consumer protection and privacy privacy, the governments, but the agencies. And so they're a place where we can share our experiences and discuss issues. The main one for our consumer world is the International Consumer Protection Enforcement Network, ICEPEN, but we also have a whole alphabet soup. So we have GPEN, the Global Privacy Enforcement Network. We have Usenet, which deals with unsolicited communications. We have the mouthful International Mass Marketing Fraud Working Group. I think they're about to get a new name that deals with sort of real mass marketing fraud, like sweepstakes and things like that. And we spend a lot of time working in those networks, discussing issues, sharing experiences, developing things like handbooks and best practices, talking now about issues like how are consumer protection agencies using artificial intelligence to detect and mitigate consumer protection issues. So there's a lot that goes into that enforcement bucket, right? It's not just one thing, but we do also devote a substantial number of resources to the policy and technical assistance or capacity building work. On the policy side, I just want to make clear that in the international arena, as much as we are reflecting FTC and U.S. government priorities and policy choices. But that said, we're also applying that, those choices and those values and those laws in a particular consumer protection setting or issue.
So do you find when you think about the sort of consumer protections, when you think about the consumer protection enforcement side, do you sometimes show up at these meetings and go, we're having a huge robocall problem, we're looking for countries to get on board with us and help us kind of battle this on a global level? And I mean, is that the kind of approach where you sort of say, hey, we've got some big issues we really want to take on and we want to work with countries on this? Or is it more like, is it more like everyone's just sort of talking, it's not happening at sort of on the global policy side. It's more like we've got a particular person sending fraudulent emails from Canada. We're going to get a team together to cooperate with, with the enforcement agency there and sort of actually do a more targeted enforcement.
Yeah, it's funny, Jeff, you just sort of gave an example that I would have given. So when I was talking about our unsolicited communications network, Usenet, a lot of that came out of people walking into a room and saying, oh my God, our complaints from consumers about robocalls are going out of the roof. Now, in the US and other countries, that's a shared problem often with the telecommunications regulator, right? But there's been a lot of joint work in the robocall area, lots of information sharing, lots of things that have led to enforcement actions in other jurisdictions. At the FTC, one of the issues that we dealt with a lot over the past few years that's somewhat robocall related, but is a little bit broader, has been India-based call center fraud. And so, that's a problem where we've walked into the room and we've talked to not just our consumer protection counterparts, but also criminal enforcement agencies. But beyond that, also Indian businesses and business associations who have a real interest and stake in trying to keep their call center operations free of fraud. We've, really, that's a perfect example of an issue where the enforcement cooperation is very tangible, very, very granular. So we're not just talking about, well, what's your theory of the case, but what kind of authority do you have, and how can you tackle this problem?
And do you feel like the problems are more consistent or more different? I mean, when you go and say, hey, we're dealing with I don't know, concerns about environmental marketing? Is everyone nodding their heads around the room, or they're like, we don't know what you're talking about? Like, how much of it is the issues we're seeing really are global ones, and so it's very easy to kind of share information, ideas, enforcement approaches, or are the problems really different? What's your experience on that front?
Yeah, I'd say it depends. So environmental marketing, everybody would shake their head. Right now, there's a lot of discussion going on about environmental claims. It's a business that the FTC has been in for a long time, has had a pretty active enforcement program on misleading environmental claims. We brought our case against Volkswagen a number of years ago relating to their clean diesel claim, which turned out
ever, right?
one of our biggest cases ever, yes, and we obtained, I can't remember exactly, somewhere around $14 billion in redress for consumers. But I would say other countries would definitely nod their heads. First of all, I think we're in a moment, not just the pandemic moment, but there are a lot of factors that have put the environment and sustainability at the top of a lot of people's agendas. So in some countries, the Consumer Protection Agency is taking on a role in maybe a government-wide sustainability initiative. But it's a big topic of conversation in all of the organizations and networks we belong to. And we've done a lot of work in this area. As you know, Jeff, we have business guidance that we call our green guides that explain to businesses the kinds of substantiation they need for environmental marketing claims. I think those guidelines were last renewed in 2012, and they're up for revision in 2022. But I see, for example, that our counterparts at the UK's Competition and Markets Authority have just announced a whole initiative that they're going to be doing to look at environmental marketing claims in a more holistic way as, again, part of their government's overall interest in environmental issues. So that's one that people would definitely nod their heads and say, yes. There are some other things, one of the things about Consumer Protection Agencies is that not everyone has the same powers. So, for example, the FTC does private, counterparts don't. There's maybe a separate data protection authority in their country. And so even in some countries they'll work together, but in some countries they're a bit siloed. In some countries, for example, Australia, our closest counterpart, the Australian Competition and Consumer Commission, also has product safety responsibility. United States, we have the Consumer Product Safety Commission. So it's, there's not always a complete alignment of interests, but there's usually more than enough issues, particularly advertising issues, where everybody in the room will shake their head. And I want to mention this at the end too, but I'll mention it now. The OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, has a consumer policy committee, and it is having a conference. It will be virtual in June of this year to look at a number of consumer protection issues of the future. And one of its panels is going to be on what the OECD calls the green economy. So just a lot of different issues relating to environmental marketing. And that's a conference where I know the OECD is actively looking for business. Certainly be more than happy to welcome anybody who wants to attend just by registering on the OECD's website. But the registration's not ready yet.
So I think that maybe this is a great segue to talk a little bit about where these conversations are happening. You talk a lot about the OECD. Maybe you can just talk a little bit about the process. When agencies or governments are sort of coordinating on these issues, sort of how does the agenda get set? What's the process there? What's the end result? Is it just like, we're going to talk about these issues and it was great to see each other, or are there specific goals and objectives that come out of these meetings?
Yeah, so I think it's different for different countries. The State Department in the United States is the lead for the United States participation in international organizations. But we've been fortunate that they've called on us, knowing our expertise, a very active role in a number of international organizations. The OECD is one, APEC, the Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation, the OAS, the Organization of America, the UN Conference on Trade and Development, and I could go on. I'll talk about the OECD because personally, that's where I've done the most work over the year. And the OECD has a professional secretariat. It has a bureau with members elected from probably 5 or 6 of the member countries. And the OECD right now has, I believe, probably about 37 member countries, but also in our discussions includes participants from non-member countries, both to join the OECD as well as countries that are just interested in what the OECD is doing and hoping to learn from that. And in the OECD Committee on Consumer Policy, where the agenda really gets set mostly by the members. It's the issues that we're seeing every 2 years. We come up with a program of work and budget, and we talk about what we want to work on. That often has to align with the OECD objectives, but they have a project on going digital. And I think we're now in Going Digital 2 and the next iteration Going Digital 3. And so, a lot of these issues obviously align with their overall objectives. But some of the things that we've done in the OECD, do we talk? Sure, but we do more than talk. One bucket of work we've done are called OECD Council recommendations. They're very, very high-level recommendations that come from the Council, which means all of the member states' highest representatives have bought into this. And so in 2016, we revised the OECD's e-commerce guidelines, which had first come out in 1999 and sorely needed an update. And they are high-level guidelines on everything from advertising and marketing and good business practices online to online disclosures, payment confirmation, redress, privacy and security. I mean, they're both detailed and high level, if they can be that at the same time. And many countries use that. Some use it informally. Some use it to form the basis of their laws. A lot of self-regulatory organizations look to OECD council recommendations as, sort of some as a basis. For example, the International Standards Organization looked to the OECD guidelines in promulgating its standards, but some look to it just, do we have consistent best practices? So there's the bundle of policy recommendations. Then there's a lot of analytical work that goes on. And when I say analytical, both sort of research about developments, but also some empirical work. So the analytical work, right now, the committee is about to do a report. It's just getting started, but they're looking at the issue of dark commercial patterns online, sort of user interfaces that may nudge consumers into making choices that, may be contrary to their interests.
Can you talk more about that? I think that this is an issue that people are probably it's such an emerging issue. I think people may be less familiar with it. Maybe you can talk a little bit more about what you mean by dark commercial patterns.
Sure. Let me step back and just mention a few things, then I'll turn to that. And I'll say I don't know yet because we're just starting the work. But we've also done empirical research through the committee. So the committee, for example, a few years ago did a study of, I think it was consumers in 10 countries looking at their levels of trust and what were the drivers of consumer trust on sharing economy platforms. And so you can take a look at that research and see actually, well, what drives consumer trust? And, there's a whole host of factors from privacy and data security and secure payment mechanisms and being able to see pictures. So it's fascinating research, and the committee also recently released research on online disclosures and personalized pricing. And then finally, and I want to mention this and then I'll go back to the other issue, is the committee also puts out good practice guides aimed at an industry. And so in 2019, it put out a trio of guides, one on online advertising, one on consumer reviews and ratings, and one on the use of consumer data. They're not necessarily policy in that they often just explain different approaches and how countries have taken different approaches to an issue, and then try and distill some tips for businesses. So that's the kind of output in a policy organization, and I think a lot of it is highly relevant to the advertising industry. Stepping back, dark commercial patterns. So this is, I would say every year there's some new set of buzzwords that I need to learn. There are a lot of researchers and people around the world who have done some thinking about this. Essentially, it's the idea of, to use another buzzword, choice architecture. So interfaces for users on websites or mobile devices that the lingo is that would tend to nudge consumers in one way or another. In the privacy area, there has been a lot of discussion about, do user interfaces sort of push consumers into making privacy decisions, i.e. decisions to give up certain data or that might be contrary to their interests. In the consumer area, it's a very amorphous concept, I would say, from my personal perspective at this point, because I've heard people talk about dark commercial patterns relating to businesses sneaking extra goods or services into a consumer's basket or cart online, which I think we could all agree is, probably already deceptive in most countries, to practices like confirm shaming. Are you sure you don't want to give us your email and get a 15% discount kinds of things? I probably have been at this too long, because I often laugh, when I get all those, are you sure you want to do this? Or are you sure you don't want to do this? Some jurisdictions consider that to be, a dark pattern. I certainly the FTC, this is an area that's emerging for us. There are countries that have looked at this more. Our colleagues in the Netherlands at the ACM, the Authority for Consumers and Markets, put out a publication this year on just a whole range of online practices that they consider dramatic. They name this as one of them. It's an interesting document, because I think it shows some of the issues we've been discussing. There are things in that document that, certainly from an FTC perspective, clearly would violate the FTC Act. There are other practices where, they're more novel and perhaps it's unclear. And those are the kinds of issues I think that we'll all be thinking about a little bit more in the future, as to whether, at least from an FTC enforcement perspective, whether they are in fact deceptive or unfair within the sort of way that phrase has been interpreted in decades of enforcement decisions.
Is it kind of like the yin and the yang of privacy by design? It's like buy more by design. It's almost like structuring either advertising or an interaction in a way that leads consumers down a road that if they were fully informed, maybe they wouldn't go down that road. Is that kind of the?
I think that's the theory behind the study. Sure, but
would you like fries with that?
Yeah. But I think, again, that it's one of these issues where it is interesting to look at it internationally, because there has been work in other countries. There's now some of this work going on in this international policy organization. I know at the FTC, in our recent funding bill, Congress did ask the FTC to write a study about the use of artificial intelligence to deal with certain consumer protection issues. And one that they mention is, I think they call it manipulative user interfaces or something like that. So I think it's an interesting area where everybody's going to land on it. May not be the same place, but it's certainly an area where exchanging international experiences and the kinds of what legal theories or laws people and what precedent people are looking to, can help inform the analysis.
Well, I think that, and I think interestingly, right, of course, FTC's, Section 5 is broad enough to encompass our commercial patterns. I mean, you'd probably call it an unfair practice and, enforce against it that way. I mean, I actually think there were this series of cases, I don't know, a decade ago, it was those pop-up cases, where the sort of the software would take over your computer and you'd have to pay to make it go away.
Malware, right?
Yeah, that kind of thing. So when we talk about sort of all of this enforcement cooperation and approaching these issues together, what are the limits of FTC's jurisdiction from an enforcement standpoint? Where can you go after practices?
So that's a really good question, and it's a very wonky question that lawyers like me have spent a lot of time thinking about. But there is a clear answer. And so the FTC Act actually provides that the FTC can have jurisdiction over foreign conduct when it's reasonably foreseeable that there would be harm to U.S. consumers, or when there is material conduct in the United States that harms consumers in the United States and abroad. So, we're not running around, we're not filing cases in foreign courts or running around the world trying to be, the arbiter of what happens between any two countries. Our touchstone is American consumers, right? Protecting American consumers and ensuring that practices from abroad that cause them harm are remedied. So that's sort of the limits of our jurisdiction in terms of our international enforcement, but it means that we can tackle a wide range of harms that come from abroad. It also means that enforcement cooperation is important, and sometimes, if there are actors in one country, we might work very closely with that country in its enforcement. We generally don't do what would be called joint enforcement, but we do parallel enforcement. I'll give you an example. A few years ago, there was a company called Ashley Madison. They were a big international dating site. They were really a big international matrimonial infidelity site. They had members in something like 50 countries. They were based in Canada. We were very interested in their practices because of two things. One, they had a data breach. Two, they were using fake profiles to lure consumers onto the site. We brought our own case, but we worked very closely with Canada's Office of the Privacy Commissioner, which did its own investigation, and with the Australian Information Commissioner, which also did its own investigation. So it's an example of we have the jurisdiction to sue the company based in Canada, right, that is harming U.S. consumers. But as a practical matter, it made a lot of sense, given that the company was based in Canada, to work closely with our counterparts on the enforcement. And there are other examples too. That one just happens to be a sort of well-publicized one, I think, probably because of the salacious content of the actual business.
Yeah, that definitely brings the privacy breach issue a little bit to home to many people. At least I'm sure it did. So, maybe talking a little bit about the FTC for a second, or sort of talking about the FTC's kind of role and the role it plays. You know, what is the sort of FTC's role as an independent agency in the U.S. government? What does that mean? How does that affect the way the FTC approaches these issues? And sort of, if one big issue that we can't avoid talking about is the pandemic, the next issue that we can't avoid talking about is that it's a new administration. You've got a new acting chair. You've got new senior leadership of the commission, or at least acting senior leadership. How does the role as an independent agency impact the sort of continuity in the way that the FTC approaches its enforcement over time?
So that's a great question, and one that we at the FTC are all thinking about. Being an independent agency, we are run by a commission. There are 5 commissioners. Each serves 7-year staggered terms. So just in terms of leadership, it means that you have commissioners who come from both parties. And the way it works is, I believe that no more than 3 commissioners can be from the same party. The president appoints the chair. But it means that you have, and I started out by saying that the FTC is a bipartisan agency. It does mean that the people, the commissioners who are in charge of the agency, are bipartisan. And so that's a little bit different from, an agency, for example, like the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, which has a director appointed by the president and is then, very much will follow the policy of the president, the party that's in power. The FTC, to get consensus on cases and policy issues, really, at least 3 commissioners have to agree. And in the last administration, we saw a lot of very interesting lineups in terms of decision-making by our commissioners. In terms of the future, as you alluded to, Jeff, we've just had a new acting chair appointed by President Biden. So Rebecca Slaughter is now our acting chair. She has been a commissioner at the agency since 2018, so she's not coming in new. She's our acting chair. She has made appointments of acting heads of our different bureaus and divisions, consumer protection, our Bureau of Economics. It remains to be seen sort of what the permanent leadership will be. But I think there is continuity in the sense that, the appointees all are people who have deep experience with the FTC. And over the decades, traditionally, the FTC has sometimes emphasized one type of case over the other. We've been more focused on privacy issues in the last few years than we had been beforehand. But there's always been a high degree of continuity. And in previous or outgoing chair, Joe Simons really cracked down on a variety of misleading practices and, was the driving force behind some of our biggest enforcement actions, including our big Facebook for violating an earlier privacy order, which netted a $5 billion settlement, as well as very significant conduct relief. So I think that there's a way in which the FTC will continue to be very consistent, but I think there's also, and the open question is, what is both the change in leadership at the administration level, as well as the change of control in Congress, mean for consumer protection? There are a lot of interesting issues that have been bubbling up, everything from platform responsibility and liability to, pricing issues, drip pricing issues, to, online reviews. There's a lot of legislation that's been introduced in the last few. So it remains to be seen, what role, whether that legislation will be passed, what role it gives for the FTC. And that's particularly true in terms of federal privacy legislation, which is also a hot topic. So I guess, and it's sort of a cop-out, but I think you'll see both continuity and change at the same time.
Well, look, I think that one of the things that maybe, I don't know if surprising is the right word, but there was not only an incredible amount of continuity between the Biden and the Trump administration, but really, I mean, the FTC continued to really advance some of the existing agenda and break new ground, I think, on many issues. And so, I think it is interesting when we think about what does this look like, particularly after some of the very public conversations among the commissioners about, do we need to be more aggressive? Do we need tougher orders? Do we need, damages in more cases? It'll be interesting to sort of see how that progresses. What are some of the issues? Certainly, pandemic-related issues. The FTC approached the pandemic in a way, in sort of at a micro level, maybe that we hadn't really seen the FTC approach anything, and I don't know, that in time I could think of. And certainly the financial impact of the pandemic is certainly going to, continue to be an approach. But looking at it from sort of a broader kind of global perspective, what are some of the key issues that you see are likely to be areas of FTC focus that you also see are going to align pretty closely with what's going on with other agencies around the world?
Yeah. So we talked about one of them, which is environmental marketing. As I mentioned, I think that's really a very big issue for a lot of countries right now. In terms of the FTC, I think these conversations that are going on, as I mentioned, about platform responsibility and platform liability are likely to play out in some way. Who knows how exactly, but certainly very interesting. I mentioned earlier that Congress had directed us to write a report on, the use of artificial intelligence, and that will be, I think, an interesting area.
What do you think? Where do you see?
In December.
I was going to say, using IA, AI. What are some of the ways in which you think where you see that going? I mean, that seems very micro to me, right? I mean, like the FTC gets consumer complaints in databases.
I don't think we can say yet. Stay tuned. But what I was gonna point to as an area of interest is the FTC has a power. It's under 6B of our act that allows us to direct companies to submit confidential information to us so that we can study the industry. In some countries, this is called a market study. And in December, after the U.S. election and before the new administration came in, the commission sent what are called 6B orders to 9 social media and streaming companies, asking a wide range of questions, everything about data use and collection to practices, advertising practices directed towards teens, to what kinds of research the companies do into user engagement. So I think this whole sort of digital area and ecosystem, we saw this come out of the commission in December, and certainly, that's going to be something that will be very interesting going forward. I wanted to say one other thing about what's being discussed globally and what we might see at the FTC. So globally, there's a huge conversation about issues at the intersection of competition, consumer protection, and privacy. And in a way, the FTC is well situated for those discussions, since we have enforcement authority and expertise in all of those areas. How that plays out, I think, we'll see. But I think in terms of the intense focus on that internationally, and we see it, for example, in Europe, where the European Commission put out 3 legislative proposals, one called the Digital Markets Act, one called the Digital Services Act, and one called the Digital or Data Governance Act, that try to get at a number of practices by online platforms. They call them gatekeeper platforms. The European model is probably very US and at the FTC, but yet it tees up I think, a number of issues that other jurisdictions are looking at. Our colleagues in the UK have done a number of studies and are setting up a digital markets unit within their Competition and Markets Authority. Our colleagues in Australia, too, have put out several reports on these issues. So, who knows what will happen? We're going to have a new commission with members. As I said, we may have some new legislation from Congress. We don't know. But those are the kinds of issues that are being discussed globally that I all hear being discussed in the United States and at the FTC.
Is harmonization a priority? How does that come up? What's the, some companies feel that one of the challenges to being a global brand and marketing globally is sort of dealing with the different laws that apply in different countries. How does that play into the discussions?
That's a very interesting issue. So, in the consumer protection area and in the privacy area, there are a lot of externalities that affect laws and enforcement. There are cultural values, there are legal frameworks. Compare the First Amendment in the United States, which places the government's ability to regulate even commercial speech. And so that informs a lot of the way that we look at advertising law, to in Europe, for example, where their Charter of Fundamental Rights expressly includes privacy of all sorts as a fundamental right. So harmonization seems to me to be not really the right word we should use. And it's interesting because I have a workshop in, I think, March 2019, where we asked this very question. We had a big set of hearings about the FTC's international program. They're all available online, just the transcript, the video. And we had a panel with cultural legal framework differences and said, what should we be doing here? I think that there are different answers for consumer protection, privacy, and competition, but certainly what we're aiming for is sort of a high-level consensus. That's what we do, for example, in these international organizations. I've heard other words used, convergence, particularly convergence towards best practices. There's interoperability is another term that has been used. So you don't have to have the same laws, but are they somehow... So, there's certainly a lot about that. I think harmonization, I can see from a business perspective where it would be much easier to have the same exact laws in all countries. But I don't know that, given sort of some of these very profound differences in cultural attitudes and legal frameworks, for lack of a better word, I don't know whether harmony is the goal.
So we are almost out of time, and so let me ask you one last question, which is,
Oh wow!
No, I know, it went fast. Yeah, the companies that are interested in being a part of this dialogue, associations that are interested in being part of this dialogue around the world, what do you think are the best ways for them to contribute?
Yeah, so I think that's really important. I think it's very important for the FTC or any consumer protection agency to hear from a wide range of stakeholders. In our international work at the OECD, for example, there is a formal business constituency called Business at OECD. But we also at the FTC have very informal stakeholder mechanisms that really anyone who's interested in, we're happy to share what's going on and get comments. So, that's something that you and I can talk a little bit more about in terms of IAA participation. And then, as I mentioned earlier, the OECD is having this big public conference about consumer, what's happening, what's going to happen in consumer protection going forward. And I think that's a terrific place for there to be participation from the advertising industry, because a lot of those discussions will help, as we talked about earlier, inform what's on the agenda for the policymaking organizations going forward. So a wide range of stakeholders, and certainly business and the advertising industry is a very important voice to be heard, because you're the ones whose business this is, and you can often tell us, that makes a lot of sense, and we wish there was a clear rule about that, or really that makes no sense at all. There's no evidence that practicing, and here's why. So I think it's an important part of the conversation, and look forward to chatting more about how we can get that input.
All right. Thank you so much, Stacy. Thanks for doing this and for sharing your thoughts.
Thanks, Jeff.
Very, very interesting. And thanks to everyone who joined us today for our first Fireside Chat. Check out the link for information about our next masterclass on the outlook for online advertising for 2021. Thanks, everyone. Have a great day. Bye. Thanks again, Stacy.
Bye.